Good evening. It's 7 o'clock in the evening in Berlin, 1 o'clock in the afternoon in New York. My name is Kirill Gerstein, and this is IDAGIO Live, and this is my view across the keyboard, where every week I have the pleasure and the privilege to tell you about some recordings that I'm busy with that week, or I think are the next things that I can't resist and share with you. So today, and on my mind a bit this week, was the Strauss Burlesque, the piece for piano and orchestra that Richard Strauss wrote it as a young man in about 1885-86 when he was 21, and he was the assistant of Hans von Bülow in Meiningen, a great personality, quite near the center of the events of the 19th century music. Hans von Bülow was a student of Liszt at a certain point, and for some time also Liszt's son-in-law, because he was married to Cosima, who eventually dumped Hans von Bülow and married Richard Wagner. And Hans von Bülow nevertheless continued to champion Wagner's works, and was a great conductor, great pianist, an important musical figure. And we'll get to the Strauss Burlesque, but I can in a second. But I can't resist making the parallel, because the Tchaikovsky concerto, the first concerto, was famously given a very negative reception by Nikolai Rubinstein, who was an important figure for Tchaikovsky. And as so often happens, and we have to be mindful of that as instrumentalists, myself as a pianist, when you tell a composer something is unplayable, then comes the next person who will play it wonderfully. And so it happened with the Tchaikovsky first piano concerto, that Nikolai Rubinstein says this is unplayable and this is nonsense. And who picks it up? Hans von Bülow picks it up and plays it wonderfully, makes the world premiere in Boston, somewhat unexpected for the Tchaikovsky piano concerto at that time. And then we get to the Strauss Burlesque, and the reason I'm bringing up this story is that Richard Strauss shows this new piece he wrote, which incidentally at first he called a scherzo, and then there was some rebranding that happened, and so from a scherzo for piano and orchestra it became the burlesque. And he shows it to Hans von Bülow. This is now, say, some 10 years after the Tchaikovsky concerto story, and now Hans von Bülow, it's his turn to say this is unplayable nonsense. So Richard Strauss does the next possible thing. So he tries to conduct and rehearse this piece at the same time, trying the piano part himself. Now, I've played this piece, and those colleagues of mine that have played it will admit that this is a very, very tricky and challenging piano part under any circumstances. And you can just imagine when the orchestra didn't know it, Strauss hadn't had any practical experience with it, and it so happens that he tries to play the piano, and that goes disastrously. So the first reading is so discouraging that even Strauss himself says to Hans von Bülow, well, perhaps under the best circumstances, and if there is a first-class pianist, first-class first conductor, first-rate conductor, then maybe it will be something else than the nonsense that it was. And after the first rehearsal, he says he's very discouraged. So the piece is in the drawer for a while, and then tada, comes the next virtuoso, who in fact does play the thing, one would suppose wonderfully, and that's Eugene d'Albert. Eugene d'Albert, another student from a younger generation of Liszt students, and also a legendary pianist, one that actually has left some recordings, and perhaps at some point I can turn your attention to those as well. There are some wonderful salon compositions by Eugene d'Albert. He also was married a number of times, including the most pertinent to piano history. He was married to the great Venezuelan virtuosa pianist, Teresa Carreño, who supposedly really quite retooled her playing, and after coming in touch with Dalbert, and was a legendary pianist. And in fact, one of the people on my playlist today, which you can find at #ViewAcrossTheKeyboard on IDAGIO Live. Today is about Richard Strauss and his burlesque for piano orchestra. One of the pianists I selected is Claudio Rau, who recalled that when he heard Teresa Carreño before the war in the Berliner Philharmonie, in the old one, which we discussed last week, that she made an absolutely legendary impression on him, playing Beethoven's third, fourth, and fifth concerto in one evening, which is still a daring thing to do, but was absolutely unheard of at the time. So that's Eugene Dalbert and his wife Teresa Carreño, who incidentally pursued a career in singing for a few years before returning to the piano. So those were the days. And Eugene Dalbert plays the piece wonderfully. Hans von Bülow ends up conducting it, which is additionally ironic because Nikolai Rubinstein, after being so negative about the first piano concerto of Tchaikovsky, also ends up somewhat changing his mind and ends up conducting the piece. And so Hans von Bülow conducts it and is still not entirely taken by it. He writes to Brahms that there's some genius in Strauss's burlesque, but much of it is crazy nonsense. And so this is a piece that even today and through the last century has had very enthusiastic champions and some very great pianists that have played it. Conductors are taken by it because there's a lot of conducting to be done in the piece. This is not a concerto that plays by itself. And as you will hear, and I hope you listen to at least one of the performances on the playlist, if not several, and go off onto researching all the other performances I didn't name that are also on IDAGIO or in your discography. So the piece has had enthusiastic champions, and the piece is very interactive between strands of chamber music like music making and a very quick, you could say almost comedic interplay between the soloist and the orchestra. So everybody's busy, everybody quite enjoys it, but it's a bit of a weird animal despite some very important champions. It's a wonderful length, I think. It's about 19-20 minutes. I enjoy playing it very much, and combining it with another piece. You can combine it with a number of these concertos that are slightly orphaned on the programs because they're slightly too short to always program them alone, though the Strauss Burlesque is regularly programmed as the only piece for the piano soloist to play on the program. But there's a number of shorter pieces such as the Totentanz, such as Shostakovich Liszt and Shostakovich's second piano concerto, and maybe the left-hand concerto. So there's a chance to make a combination between the Strauss Burlesque and for example, one of the pieces that I just named. And in fact, this piece, and I'll play a little bit of music so you don't just hear myself talking. It's in fact a piano concerto piece that starts with a very, very important solo of the timpani. And in fact, if I'm not wrong, I believe that they even have it as an orchestral excerpt, the timpanist. So we always give a bow to the timpanist also when playing this piece, because this is really perhaps the second or third most important person after the conductor, who can make or break the piece, and the piano soloist who can make or break the piece. So there's a lot of breakable parts in the burlesque. But here's the beginning, and perhaps the example that I'll refer today to is the recording by Friedrich Gulda. Now, there's a number of recordings, I selected for this broadcast today. But Friedrich Gulda, first of all, we were just celebrating his 90th anniversary a couple of days ago, and a wonderful pianist, one I think that I will want to speak about more in the upcoming episodes. But this recording is a live one, and Gulda is a young man, I believe in his late 20s. And it's a recording with Carl Böhm conducting the Wiener Philharmonica from the Salzburg Festival, as I said, from a concert. And I think it may be one of my top choices, one of my favorites for the burlesque. And I think Gould is just playing brilliantly. So here's Friedrich Gulda. I think you can see my screen. This is the IDAGIO app on my computer. And this is the burlesque for piano orchestra by Richard Strauss and Friedrich Gulda, Carl Böhm, Wiener Philharmonica, August 1957, as you can see from the Salzburger Festspiele. Wonderful. I hope this gives you immediately a little teaser, a little taste of how this will continue, because it continues in a very dynamic way, in the sense of how many changes there are, I think, in the piece. I think you can say that it's perhaps, well, obviously a piece about 3/4 and something about the waltzing, and then there's kind of a parody of waltz, and there is slow and lyrical waltzing at the end. And that's another excerpt I won't be able to resist and show you, is a part that shows that young Strauss was able to write music that is already Rosenkavalier-like, and thus much later in his output. But he's able to do it in his early 20s to say produce substance that makes an impression of a much older, mature, and nostalgic kind of personality than one would imagine he would have been at the age of 21. But one of the features that you just heard, and Liszt is already a name that I've spoken several times, even in this episode. So you heard the quick broken figure in the two hands chromatically going down. So so this is kind of a running thread through this piece, and one of the other great champions of this composition, namely Glenn Gould, and there was no pun intended in selecting an excellent recording of this piece by Gulda and by Glenn Gould. Nevertheless, Gould was a wonderful speaker about music, I think at all times. And there's an excerpt of a documentary on Strauss that you can see on YouTube. And I'd like to play a bit of it. I don't know when I will stop, but he talks in a very amusing way about what he thinks this passage represents, and what in fact the piece itself represents. And I think this is not to be missed. And his recording, Glenn Gould's recording, one of his several recordings, and it is to be said, like I mentioned about Friedrich Gulde, that this is the live recording that I selected for you because I think it's special with that live atmosphere. But Gulde also made a commercial recording of the piece, so a more studio oriented performance. But here's Glenn Gould, if it was start from the right spot, if the gods of YouTube will have mercy on me. And here's Gould talking about the Strauss burlesque. So I hope you'll continue watching that. You can find that under, if you look for Glenn Gould and you look for Glenn Gould and Humphrey Burton on Strauss Part 1, and that will be several minutes into that clip. And I think you can see Gould's point about the Lisztian harmony, and of course how Liszt and Wagner paved the way for Mahler and Richard Strauss and Schoenberg, and how tonality does indeed, well, perhaps not disintegrate, but at least fray under this chromaticism that, like quantum particles, particular ones, pop up in very unexpected places. So through the diminished chord, you can go like a wormhole or gateway to many foreign keys in a very quick fashion. So Gould is also on that playlist playing the Strauss burlesque. He also recorded it a number of times. The recording I selected for you is one with Toronto Symphony with Vladimir Boltzmann, but you can and should research the other ones and see which one you like most. A couple more that I added, there are 4 on the playlist here. One with Claudio Arrau, the great Chilean pianist, one of the towering ones of 20th century pianism, and ones whose recordings I think wear very well. There's something very lasting about his serious and I think very sincere approach to music that he played. But Claudio Arrau played this piece with Richard Strauss himself in, I believe, in the 1930s in Germany. And in fact, my dear friend, wonderful conductor Semyon Bichkov, when I played the Strauss burlesque with him, he told me that the first time he worked with Claudio Arrau, or maybe it was the second time, he said, well, I played this piece with Richard Strauss back in Europe. So this is sounds terribly impressive. The interesting thing about Claudio Arrau, and the reason why I said but, is that I think a lot of you might know him as this more serious, in fact, sometimes criticized as overly serious pianist in his later years. But this was also a certain kind of rebranding, like going from scherzo to the burlesque, because Arrau in his earlier years was really a firebrand virtuoso. There are wonderful early recordings of his playing, among other things, in fact, Liszt etudes. And Arrau is another student, a student of another Liszt pupil, Martin Krause in Berlin. And so you see that many paths lead to Liszt as sort of the great tree of which we're all branches and leaves, as Ferruccio Busoni famously said. So this is Claudio Arrau playing on the playlist, playing with the new harmonic, and George Sell, who in fact, I believe I'm not wrong, was Strauss's conducting assistant right here in Berlin at the Staatsoper, and was himself an excellent pianist. And one more I couldn't resist to add to the playlist is a pianist, you could say, living legend, Byron Janis, a great pianist, a very important student, one of the few students of Vladimir Horowitz. And he made a famous recording of this piece with Fritz Reiner conducting the Chicago Symphony in 1957, as IDAGIO kindly tells me. And if you're interested in flukes, you can also search for another pianist playing with Fritz Reiner, the Strauss burlesque, and this is William Capell, another pianist I'd like to turn to in future episodes. One of the very greatest pianists that America ever produced, and one that tragically died in his early 30s, returning from a concert tour in Australia when his airplane crashed into a mountain near San Francisco. And the reason why I say it's a fluke, because and there's even there was a big debate whether this should be released or not, is because this was one of the occasions that as a practicing pianist I know, and I think all colleagues, instrumentalists know, this was an occasion when Capell was committed to play this piece and had perhaps miscalculated the time he needed to learn it and wanted to change it at last minute. And apparently Fritz Reiner, who seems to have lived up to his stern reputation, he decided to make a point of this to Capell and didn't let him change the piece. So this is Capell heroically struggling through a piece he had just a few days to prepare. And those of us that have tried the burlesque all know that this is really not a piece one wants to learn last minute. It's also because of that passage that Gould was illustrating. This is a piece that is not so easy to memorize, because it's the kind of pieces where you're on a highway and you take exit 34 and you go to the right place where the orchestra bus is also going. But in fact, exit 34 looks very similar to exit 28. And if you take that one, you actually end up going over the highway, and then you're in some village where nobody came along with you. So it's tricky to memorize in that kind of sense of similar repeating structure that then goes in different directions. So one really has to be careful. But anyway, so the Byron Genesis recording is quite legendary. And before I stop blabbering and let you explore these recordings in your own on your own time, peace and quiet, I hopefully get to the right place in the recording and want to play you that spot that I mentioned earlier, the spot that to me already doesn't hark back, but harks to the future, so to say, of Rosenkavalier and this nostalgic, sentimental, immediately recognizable as Straussian quality. And this episode comes towards the end of the piece, right before the stormy coda and a sarcastic last couple of gestures finish the piece that sort of evaporates in this scherzo-like fashion. So here's another excerpt of the Strauss burlesque, and this is at the very end of the piece. If I raise the volume. Yeah, I think this is one of the bits that that makes me thankful for playing the piece. But as I said, really the whole piece is quite delightful. As a curiosity, you might also look at the YouTube recording. It's audio only, based on age. It's one of the very last concerts of Richard Strauss by then in his 80s, with an Austrian Jewish pianist, Alfred Blumen, who spent the war in an internment camp. I think Strauss and he knew each other before the war. This was in some way a demonstration post-war in London of these people being brought together again, coming together again. Doesn't sound like it's going well musically. There's a lot of disagreement between the conductor, the orchestra, and the pianist, and some flimsy piano playing there, but it's a curiosity, and Strauss is conducting it. Shows something about the fact that he cared about these all early pieces of his, even at this advanced age by then. So I hope you'll do some exploring of the Strauss burlesque, and I hope to see you next week here on IDAGIO Live. I'm Kirill Gerstein, I'm a pianist, and you can find things relating to these broadcasts under hashtag view across the keyboard. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Send a comment, send a disagreement, send an agreement, say hello, and tune in next week, and I'll share something else from the countless riches that are at our fingertips or finger taps on a service such as IDAGIO, and available as treasures in the world at large. Stay well, stay healthy.